welcome. Here we are, approaching Lent 4, immersing ourselves in possibly one of the best-known Jesus stories, and having a nice cross-section of them all two here with Andrew in Lincoln, Gary in Gore, and Lisa in Palmerston North, and also Lisa with some background. Let's roll on and explore this parable.
Well, yes. I mean, as you say, one of the most familiar parables, the one we all knew from Sunday school, the wonderful story of the father and his two sons. One who stays home and does everything right, and one who does something outrageous, squanders his inheritance and comes home when there's nowhere else to go. And it's a parable that has inspired artists, perhaps the most significant of which is Rembrandt's remarkable painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son, which inspired an equally remarkable book by Henri Nouwen. And if you haven't read this little book, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a story that speaks to the heart. It contains the most beautiful image of God as an all-forgiving, merciful God who runs down the road to meet us and welcome us home. And it captures all that we all long and hope for. But in this story's delightful familiarity, it's easy for us to miss just how outrageous, shocking this story would have been to Jesus' listeners, especially to the grumbling Pharisees. We're likely to see the father and his actions as unambiguously good, generous, loving, and the brother who stayed home as bitter, rigid, and ungenerous. But that is not how it would have sounded to the Jewish listeners. So the prodigal son has been living with pigs, so he is ritually unclean. By embracing his son, the father does the unthinkable. He makes himself unclean, puts himself outside of religious society. And I think that puts a different spin on the older brother's position. From a Jewish perspective, he does the right thing by staying outside, because if he'd gone in, he too would be ritually unclean. So the father is asking the son who stayed home to do the unthinkable. He's asking him to step outside the norms of religious society, to behave in unacceptable ways. He's asking him to become one of the unclean. So the story is not quite as simple as we might think, and perhaps I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, gee, thanks for throwing the challenge at our feet. Andrew, tell me what you find challenging.
I'm not really sure that I could follow that with too much at all, actually. One of the things that strikes me is the absurdity of the situation. This younger son demanding his share of the estate before his father is even dead. It's abominable. It's appalling that that any son or daughter would want that. And so that's the first part of it. The second thing that seems to me is that I wonder, what does the father need to sell? What does he need to cash up? What does he need to remortgage in order to give his younger son his 1/3 share? Because presumably the elder brother would have got 2/3 because he got the double portion. And it's actually at that point, it's really quite a shocking story. And I find that really quite challenging.
I love that we're tapping into that shock factor. Gary, for you, challenge?
Well, I would have been as challenged as the eldest son, I think, the older brother. And bearing in mind for me that this challenge is really presented to the sinners and the Pharisees who are there. And my challenge is, am I very much like them? Do I think I have the inside track on how God is presented to people? That my interpretation, my understanding of God and God's mercy is the right one and the only one? So I think that shook them to the core. And so I'm just challenged to say, keep an open mind here to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it never does any harm for us to remember how much of the Pharisees and the Sadducees perhaps there is in us. Lisa, tell me about your challenge.
Yeah, well, I went in the same direction as Gary. I think I'm probably not alone by saying most of us in the pews, there's this really uncomfortable feeling that we identify more with the older son than we do with the prodigal, the son who did everything right. And I'm going to go back to Henri Nouwen here. He says, both sons needed healing and forgiveness. Both needed to come home. Both needed the embrace of a forgiving father. But from the story itself, as well as from Rembrandt's painting, it is clear that the hardest conversion to go through is the conversion of the one who stayed at home. And I find this deeply challenging. It confronts me with something I never want to admit to, which is my goody two shoes mentality of wanting a gold star for good behavior. So what does Henri Nouwen mean by the conversion of the one who stayed at home? What do I need conversion to and from? And this is unsettling stuff.
Well, we're in Lent. Thanks for the unsettlement, all of you, I think. Gary, I'm going to ask you to come back now and start bringing us some good news in the midst, even in Lent.
For me, the good news is that no one stays lost. This boy, this second son, wasn't always lost. There was a time when he was found. He was home with the father. Through his own silliness and misunderstanding, he heads off. And even though the father, unlike in the other two stories, is actively looking for him, he waits patiently and with love in his heart, and hence breaks all societal norms within his jubilation. And there's this huge party. So for me, there's really good news that you're never too lost to come home.
I love that. Thank you. All right, we'll ask you, Lisa, to spin some good news from where you're finding this.
Yeah, so I think the good news for me is that just as the father raced down the road to find his wild, repentant son, he also goes out to find the one who is sulking in the barn. He wants both his children home with him. And when I read this, I think about how much Jesus must have longed for the Pharisees to listen, to understand, and for their hearts to soften. There must have been a real heart in him for the Pharisees. Because there's good news in the warmth of the father's response to his angry son. My son, you are always with me, and all I have is yours. And all I have is yours that's what the father offers all of us, everything he has. And I think in the whole of the parable, that is my favorite line, the one that speaks to me. The eldest son has nothing to lose in the return of his brother. All that's being asked of him is that he comes to the party.
And you're right. I love that phrase, all that I have is yours. It's overwhelming. I do want to explain my verb spin really meant extrapolate. And you weren't spinning anything, drawing out of that text, that line in particular. And so, Andrew, your turn to bring in some good news.
Well, I can't add too much to what Lisa's already said. I think here for the younger, I've got this image of the father who keeps watch every day. He's just longing, he's yearning for his son to return home, that the son might realize how deeply loved he is. And for the elder, that the elder would move away from his sense of resentment and rage, recognizing that everything that belongs to the father is actually and effectively his. It all belongs to him. And that he might realize how profoundly, how deeply loved he is.
Beautiful images, beautiful stories to encourage us, and at this point in Lent to be encouraged by them. But let's be practical and apply them. And I'll come back to you straight away, Andrew, and ask you to sort of give me a bit of a so what here.
Well, for me, what this has meant personally is an invitation to reframe my view of God. I grew up in a fairly evangelical home where God, although we talked about the love of God, God was actually one who was always with a cattle prodder, ready to zap me whenever I made a stuff up, which was on a fairly regular basis. And what Jesus does is he moves us away from that image and shows us this God who has this deep and profound yearning for each of us to come home. It also rings deeply with my Methodist current and background, where we have this concept of prevenient grace, that it's God who's actually in search of us. It's not us seeking to deserve his favor, but God is always yearning, reaching towards us in love. And I think that this, more than any other story in Jesus's library, presents that picture so richly.
Beautiful. And we need to be reminded of that sense of prevenient grace. So thank you for that. And so, Gary, for you, give me an application. So what?
Well, I'm thrilled that Jesus had two brothers that were so different in here. Because for me, what I would ask myself and ask in the congregation is, so which brother do you identify with? The most obvious sinner, if I could use that term, the younger one, actually comes to his senses before the elder one who stayed behind. The elder one, I don't think, realized he needed a conversion because he had stayed within the boundaries of his father's love and household and done what was expected of him, and yet he still needed. And so for me, that's the real thing. The challenge was actually at the Pharisees, I think. They, like the elder brothers, were the ones who needed the conversion most, to really examine their understanding of God and this incredible thing we call grace. So, yeah, my application is, which of those brothers do I most identify with? And sadly, I can see myself in both of them, but probably more in the elder one, sadly. Anyway.
Yeah, that can be a painful realization for all of us. Lisa, tell me a final so what?
Well, I think I go back to an idea that I started with in the background, that the eldest son has to do something really quite startling and unexpected and outside his comfort zone, to let go of the rules that he lives by and to be welcomed into something that feels dangerous, that's something that's, I don't know, wilder, something bigger, something so much more expansive that goes on beyond what we mean by good. And that something is the wild, vast greatness of God's love and mercy and grace. So the eldest son has this narrow definition of what good means, a narrow set of rules. And we might have this too, go to church on a Sunday, check, give money to the poor, check. But he's being invited into something so much better, so much bigger, to open his heart to love and let himself go. And so the questions we might sit with, if we were brave, is, in what ways are our ideas of goodness confining our experience of God? Perhaps we can even say, in what ways is religion confining our experience of God's love and mercy? And I pick up Andrew's point there. And the invitation here is to let go of those concepts of God and the church and goodness that confine us, to leap into something that we can never fully understand, but which we can fully experience: God's vast, wild love for all that he created. And I'd say we have nothing to lose and everything to gain. All I have is yours. The invitation is just, come on in, join the party.
Thank you so much. And I heard your phrase, wild grace, which is a phrase I just absolutely love, on top of the other one that you quoted. So all three of you have really unlocked with enthusiasm this such a well-known passage, and yet unlocked it with new energy and today's energy, if you like. Thanks for joining me. It's been a delight to journey through this one with you. Thank you.